Hello, hello, and welcome back to learning more about tarot symbolism with me, BB Soto. I was going to make this video about the symbolism in the lily that's found in the magician card, but as I started researching the meaning behind specifically the meaning referenced to the lily by A.E. Waite in his pictorial key for its presence in the magician card, I realized this was actually opening the door to a great time to introduce the idea that there is oodles upon oodles of Christian iconography in the Pamela Coleman Smith and A.E. Waite deck, known more commonly as the Rider Smith Waite deck. Um, there's a lot, so much. So this is 100% very like broad overview, abridged. We're going to touch on a little bit, just very much an introduction to even what Christian iconography is and how it came to be in the deck. And then with hopes that because there are cards down the line that are also still full of so many that it would be impossible not to mention them, and it's intentional. So yeah, let's just dive in. And I should mention this was something that I absolutely loved studying when I was in art history. This is a visual language that it resonates a lot with me because I was raised Catholic, so I'm not super religious or anything like that. But the symbolism speaks to me very like easily because it's almost like, I was raised speaking English. So, if I go to a different country and I meet someone who's speaking English, it's like, oh, I understand that language. So as much as I love all symbolism across cultures, when I come into stuff that artworks or works that have this, it's like that moment where it's like, oh, this comes easy, like I understand this. So I'm gonna geek out a little bit during this video. Okay, especially because we also get to talk about medieval art, which is one of my favorites. And why? Because it's full of symbolism. So anyway, so we're going to talk about symbolism and iconography, medieval art and tarot roots and how those two relate, Pamela Smith and A.E. Waite. Then we'll talk a little bit about the roses, lilies, and the infinity symbol in the magician card and the significance of all of this and why it matters or doesn't. I think this is actually a duplicate. Yeah, so I'm going to skip. I had two duplicate slides that I forgot to delete. So this was one of those moments where I realized, hey, I have a tendency to use these words interchangeably. Like I understand their meaning at a deep level or certain levels so much but when I actually sat down and thought about like, well, why am I going to talk about Christian iconography when usually I talk about symbolism, symbology? So I was like, hey, what do all those words mean? So I sat down and did a little bit of research on the definitions. And so symbol refers to the actual like thing we're using to symbolize something else. Symbolism is the act of using symbols to represent meanings. Symbology is the study, I guess, or use of symbols. Icon is traditionally refers to a symbol that has come to mean something specific within like a religion or maybe a group of people, whereas a symbol, it can be like anything that means something else, that represents something to a specific group. And iconography is the study of the use of symbols in art and media that specifically means something to a group. So like when we talk about, and really if we talk about Christian symbolism versus Christian iconography, we're saying the same thing. Like Christian iconography is the study of the symbols and how they are used in Christian representations to specifically mean things to Christians from the Christian faith, from the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. And especially like when we get into like that medieval, like there was a whole real language because people let me see, hold on. Am I getting ahead of myself? Yes, I'm getting ahead of myself. And my slide got a little bit mixed up. These guys are actually supposed to be down here. I don't know what happened, Canva. So like an example, okay? So the picture of a red rose can symbolize love. We know that from our rose discussion, but also like giving a red rose can symbolize love. So like the rose itself, whether in a graphical representation or a drawing or artwork, or whether like the actual act of giving a rose, that is the symbol. An icon, so like traditionally we're talking about and in the context of today's discussion, like Mary with on a throne with the gold halo and angels flying around her is an icon as Mary of the Queen of Heaven. It's venerated, it's put up in the church so that we see that, and that's Mary as the icon of the Queen of Heaven. Modern day use of icons, think like social media icons, like these little symbols we use that graphically represent like a company or an identity of a person. But it's like, and it encompasses more of like, it represents like the symbol of that company. That's essentially what a logo is too, but we use icons because they're just a visual. There's no text to them. And then so like iconography would be, and again in this context, is like we're studying the symbols that were specifically used by Christians in their artistic representations to reference and represent meanings from the stories from the Bible. So, and they're also how they used them to identify biblical figures and other saints. So now we get into the medieval art, tarot roots, Christian iconography, and how they're connected. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, so we have the Dark Ages, which are very, very early Middle Ages. That's early Christianity too. Okay, pretty much people had lost, Western Europeans had really lost literacy, and it was up to the church to educate them on stories of the Bible. And so they would decorate the churches with these big biblical, all these biblical scenes. That was how the not if you weren't a priest, a nun, bishop, all of that. That was how you learned the stories, but also how you recognized the stories. And all churches would have them because back in the Middle Ages, it was very common for people to make what was called pilgrimages. Um, one of the sacraments in the Catholic faith is that you are supposed to go to the Holy Land, which is Jerusalem, once in your life. And so that was one pilgrimage, but they also would make, if they couldn't make it to Jerusalem, they would make pilgrimages to other big holy centers around Western Europe. And these scenes would also like be recognizable to the pilgrims, but it would also help identify, like, say, if that church was dedicated to Mary, there would be scenes of Mary's life. If it was dedicated to later on, say, St. Francis, you'd see a lot of indication in the artwork around the church that this church was dedicated to St. Francis. I threw this in here because this is a time when art was very much for God's sake. And so in art history, we have really kind of three overarching, somewhat accepted themes in the progression of Western art history. And that is that art started out being for God's sake. So emulating, venerating, decorating the churches, in, like in honor of God or gods. Then it became art for man's sake, and then later on art for art's sake. We're not really going to get into the art for art's sake, but we are going to talk a little bit about the cusp between art going from God, art for God's sake, and art for man's sake. So the tarot is rooted in this game that was called tarrochi. And so the tarrochi decks had what were called trump cards, which we now call the major arcana, and then the four suits. And so this kind of gives an introduction, very brief, but I think my next slide. Okay, we'll come back to that. So the game, I'm going to move my head here. So this is an example from a tarrochi deck. Okay, and this can be seen, I think this is the one that is at the Beneke Rare Book Library at Yale. I know the Morgan Library Museum in New York also has like original old tarot, either tarot decks or tarot decks. So these earliest decks are from the 1440s, 1450s. It was a game played by Italian nobles, as seen here in this fresco from 1440 in Italy. These are tarocchi players. Here we go. Okay, I knew I had a super brief, very abridged overview of tarot's extensive history that kind of goes into this. So you've got the tarocchi decks back in the 1400s. They're using very much medieval artistic styles, meaning they're using, the same symbolism and iconography to depict scenes. They're not depicting biblical figures, so they're not quite using the Christian iconography yet. And at this time, we're still talking about, let me move myself a little bit. Okay. So we're still talking about this being a game, not yet fortune telling cards. So here is an old example of Le Bateleur. I love that. Le Bateleur. The Tarot de Marseille, which predates the Rider Smith Waite and really is kind of the basis of all tarot decks. So the Tarot de Marseille is that deck that goes like in between time, that we're taking the tarocchi game deck, we've made now a tarot deck. The first one being printed in 1709, so the 18th century, becomes the prototype for most modern tarot decks, okay? Because even the Rider Smith Waite tarot deck used this as a reference. 1789, I'm not going to say this right, Atella, Ataya, Ataya, we're going to go with Ataya because it's French, so we're going to go with Ataya, produces the first esoteric occult deck with ties to astrology and ancient Egyptian origins. So he's the one, if I'm understanding my history correctly myself, that I read, who brings in this, as we know today, these astrological correspondences, these occult meanings to his deck. So then a follower of his publishes a book on the card meanings based on his teachings, becomes the basis for about half the meanings of the minor arcana for the cards in the Rider Smith Waite deck. Now, what should be noted is that the Tarot de Marseille, the four suits, which are known as the minor arcana, those cards don't have pictures. They do, but they don't have scenes like we're used to. They have, if it's the four of coins, they have like four coins on the deck, on the card, and maybe some background imagery. And the meaning of the card is up here, and it is that esoteric, occult, mysterious meaning. It's not really found in the picture on the card. That comes with one deck before what Pamela Smith paints, that she uses as a reference very much in her deck, but the practice of having minor arcana cards have pictorial scenes really takes off with Rider Smith Waite. But sorry, okay. So then we have this period between like 1856 and the 1890s when there's a lot of publications, a lot of writing about the occult. And these writers all are giving the tarot deck a very high place in practice. 1888, phenomenal year in art history, like so many good paintings from that year, so many good things. Anyway, so and including the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is launched. And so if you're unfamiliar, I suggest you go look into it. It's like very extensive. I don't have time to get into it here. But the Golden Dawn is kind of like a secret society of actual like magicians and sorcerers and people who are interested in alchemy and the occult and like really genuinely deep diving into like trying to understand these things. And so super cool. In the 1880s, we have Dr. Papus. So he's back in France. And so if you look at it like with the birth of the Rider-Smith Waite and the Golden Dawn, and then Aleister Crowley, who made the Thoth deck, and I'm not a big fan. That's why I never really talk about it. It just doesn't speak to me. Um, so with those guys, we almost have this well, we do really kind of have this branching off of the English school of tarot. Dr. Papist comes along and he's expanding on the esoteric tarot of the French lineage from the Tarot de Marseille, and so now we kind of have these two schools of tarot, English and French, the French one being the more esoteric, based in the Kabbalah of life or sorry, Kabbalah tree of life and astrology and all of that. And the with Pamela Smith and A.E. Waite, who create the deck that is quote unquote the bedrock of Anglo-American tarot in 1909, we start to have specifically intentionally ties to Christian meanings. Okay. So Pamela Smith and A.E. Waite are both Golden Dawn members, right? A.E. Waite was like higher up in the echelon than Pamela Smith, but he did hire her because he believed she was psychic. She had synesthesia, so she would see scenes when she would listen to music. She is an artist in her own right. She did more with her career than this deck. Go look at her art and her career. She's a fascinating person. Okay, so A.E. Waite always gets, credited with being the creator of the deck. He wrote the pictorial key. He definitely had input into what the representations were going to be. But Pamela Smith is the woman who sat down and she painted out and chose these symbols and everything like that. And so the two of them team up. They wanted intentionally to have their deck be more based in Judeo-Christian mysteries than occult and magic. So therefore, their deck really is based more in representations of Christianity. Um, and going back to that mention of art for God's sake to art to man's sake, around this time is where we're starting to really see the transition in art, really, really starting to see like that we are fully leaving behind art for God's sake, coming into art for man's sake. But this symbolism, these symbols were so deeply ingrained, and Catholic and Christianity was so deeply ingrained in Western European lifestyles that at this time, what Smith and Waite were doing was they were essentially taking a deck that very few could read and they were making it accessible to more people, much like many artists today are taking their deck and trying to modernize it and make it into something that is just more accessible to us. And that's really what they were doing. And so, and then on top of that, they were both like Pamela eventually leaves the Golden Dawn behind completely and then devotes her life to Catholicism. And Waite was very fascinated with the Christian mysteries too. We'll get into a little bit more of that later. So societally, people would have still been very well versed in these images. They would have, not only would they have known, because Roman and Greco-Roman mythology and ties have remained because they were so venerated by the medieval people. And the medieval theologians, what happened was they had lost literacy, and then through a lot of different things, they found it again. They'd rediscovered Greek thought and specifically Plato. And now they had this philosopher that they're reading who predates Christ, but man, he was saying some pretty like solid things. So, and then we also have the Old Testament. This is actually really important. I'm glad I remembered to mention this because this actually comes up and is really important. So then we have the Old Testament, which is all of the stories of the Bible before Christ. And medieval theologians pretty much sat around trying to find ways to say, hey, how can we say that like we have all these stories, God was in existence before Christ, like Plato is telling us things, like he's the one that explains we all have a soul. Like, wait a minute, we thought the world began and ended with Christ. Let's tie this back. And I'm really, really, really like dumbing this down, guys. Like, please, if you are another history nerd or something, please, I'm trying to make this like just relevant to this discussion without, or else we could talk about this all day. Um, so, so we're talking about a society that is born out of hundreds, thousand years of keeping alive the Greco, and then coming out of the Renaissance, which was a revival of that knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and their mythology. And so these and artists, tying these all together and showing like, hey, we can still be Christian and believe in Christ, but also acknowledge these roots that go back even further. In the Middle Ages, the Roman ruins that were laying around, that they were like this mysterious society of like, these amazing people that came before them that they wanted to emulate, but yet wanting to still remain true to Christianity. So we're talking about here in the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people still would have been very, very, very well versed in these um, images. They would have known them as well as we know, that swoosh means Nike, that check mark, just do it, or the two golden arches meaning McDonald's. Like they would have recognized the symbols as easily as we are recognizing the symbols of the major corporations that are advertising in front of us every day, all day. So, okay. So that is important because when we get to the Christian iconography and the magician card, the reason that I knew we had to talk about this was because A.E. Waite specifically quotes the Old Testament when he talks about below are the roses and the lilies, the flos campi and lilium convalium, changed into garden flowers to show the culture of aspiration. And so he is referencing a line out of the Song of Solomon that through translational interpretations and that practice that medieval theologians had of tying back, how can we tie Christ to the Old Testament, lo and behold, through a lot of really cool things that are actually like really cool how it all works out and fits together. It's awesome. Lo and behold, through all of that, long story short, we have the interpretation that in the Song of Solomon, from that, Christ is the rose, Mary is the lily of the valley, because that's what that phrase translates to in a way. Now, what I found interesting myself is that lily of the valley, like until this research, I thought lily of the valley just meant like, hey, that those lilies that grow in the valley. But there actually is a plant. There's the lily, and then there's like tons of lilies, different species of lilies. So there is the white garden flower lily that we know, the beautiful ones that are represented here in the magician card. But then there's another flower that's actually more of like a stem with these little bell-looking white flowers called lily of the valley. So we have multiple way of referencing this, and so actually Lily of the Valley was a reference to Mary and Christ. And so therefore we start to see in medieval annunciation scenes, this is not in the Bible. There's no that to my I have not been able to find a mention of Angel Gabriel giving Mary the lily in the Bible. But we start to have these scenes in medieval artworks of this is how we know this is an annunciation scene. One of the ways first of all, we have the angel. Usually Mary is shown in a domestic setting. Sometimes she's depicted just different elsewhere. Like here, she's not in a necessarily any kind of setting. Here, she's like outside of her house. But here's Angel Gabriel holding Lily of the Valley. And then here, often they're in a vase. Like they start to be coming, instead of him bringing it to her, they're now just in a vase. Another way we know this is an annunciation scene, by the way, is Mary's often shown holding a book. she's often shown in prayer at the time. And then we get to like this is these are the 14th century, and we get like 100 years later, and here the lily in is the more garden variety lily. And we've got Mary in her domestic setting here. And so that becomes a symbol because lilies were historically symbolic for light and purity. Mary is always associated with light and purity because of the fact that she was a virgin, immaculate conception. Therefore, it made sense. It made sense. And then when the medieval theologians were able to tie back this reference that just wickedly makes, like, really works out and makes sense because Christ has always been associated with that red rose due to the passion, the blood, that he spilled in sacrificing for us. So it's just crazy the way this all works out. I love it. So that's it. Like Mary. So in the magician card, we have definite like blatant references to Christ and Mary, but we're talking about like the Christian mysteries. And so, okay, this card is about manifestation. It's about sub rosa. It's about as above, so below. It's about like tuning into those mysteries and bringing them and making them into something real in the world. Well, what does that have to do with Mary and Christ? Well, one of the biggest mysteries in uh, the Christian faith is like, how? Okay, I mean, we all, for the most part, if you're raised Catholic or Christian, you accept that Angel Gabriel came down and told Mary she was going to give birth to Christ, but she was virgin. But that doesn't mean like none of us sit there and go, but how? Like it's still a big, huge mystery. Like, how does this happen? Okay, and then you have the alchemical aspect of Christ's life with the fact that he like made water turn to wine. Um, the Eucharist at a Catholic Mass, they believe that he changed the wine at the Last Supper into his blood, and everybody drank of his blood. Um, so these are the story of Mary and Christ and him being God on earth and everything is one of those big Christian mysteries. So then this was a discovery for me because above his head, we've always seen that as the infinity symbol, right? And we all know like the infinity, just like the snake around the snake belt that he's wearing, the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. It means, the life is cyclical, the never ending aspects of life. But A.E. Waite talks specifically in his card that this is a reference to the Holy Spirit. So we have God on earth represented by the roses. We have the Immaculate Conception, purity, Mary birthing God on earth, manifesting, bringing the mysteries to earth, represented by the lilies. Now we have the Holy Spirit represented by the what he calls the figure eight in a horizontal position. He doesn't even call it the infinity symbol, which the infinity symbol is a mathematical symbol dating back. He would have known that. Like, well, I mean, I can't actually say like he would have definitely known that because I didn't know that. And, I'm not a mathematician. Um, but it, it did. It's a symbol that they used in math to imply like that this continues on for infinity. And but that is not, according to him, what the presence of that symbol is. However, the fact that it has that double meaning, that's pretty freaking cool. And so he even quotes that according to Martinism, eight is the number of Christ. So he is very much telling us twice in his description of this card that Christian iconography is present in my card. Like it's present here. Okay. And so that, whether that's how you want to read it or not, like, I don't think it matters because, and I'm probably skipping ahead now to my significance because, I mean, at the end of the day, he's using Christian iconography in his terms to display a card that refers to mysteries being manifested into reality. And so either way, whether you read it with the that interpretation, the broader interpretation of the rose and the sub rosa and the lilies being innocence and purity, and that being the infinity symbol instead of a symbol of Christ, I don't think it really changes the meaning of the card that much. But I just I think it's fascinating. And so a fun discovery I made was that Waite was also obsessed with the Holy Grail during this time that he was working with Pamela Smith, and she apparently was like not quite as obsessed with him, but like she was down with that, and that the Arthurian Grail cycle, um, and yes, he wrote The Hidden Church of the Holy Grail, which that is the spelling. That is not a, I didn't misspell that. Like according to him and his and some of the Arthurian, and I'm not super well versed, believe it or not, in as much as I love medieval art and medieval stuff. I actually am not super well versed in Arthurian lore, but according to what I read, the four objects associated with Christ's passion and therefore associated with the Grail are the chalice, the lance, which ties to wands, the sword, and the dish, which ties to pentacles. So I didn't read an exact statement that said there's Holy Grail symbolism in here beyond the fact that the suits happen to tie for that and everything. um, but we do know that the fool has started the journey, and the magician is like the step into consciousness. The fool is like unaware. The magician has become aware, step into an awareness. So we're on a quest, we're on the fool's journey. I don't know. So I'm excited to see if there's more to that. So the significance, really, it's like to me, the important takeaway that I found was that first of all, there was absolutely 100% intentional, um, on the artists and Waite's part, that they were using symbolism and allegory to speak to people. Okay, that the mysteries for them were the meaning behind the meanings inside the universality of the symbolism and the symbols and the images. So for me, I encounter a lot of people who still think this is witchcraft and woo woo, and to me, that's not. The magic in it is the magic in it is the same magic that's in the fact that human beings do have some universality in the fact that like these symbols mean something, and when you see them or you're speaking about them or you're in front of them, they can help answer questions that otherwise feel unanswerable, and so that to me is the magic of them. um Symbols and iconography will change within context. This, by Waite and Smith putting this in there, they have almost transmuted like Christian iconography to now be tarot iconography. And it therefore, like, all of this persists. This ties us back to our ancestors. This ties us back to our roots. And it doesn't mean that like any of these readings need to take on any kind of Christian significance or reading or look through those lens, but it just, I think the more you realize what these symbols mean historically, like, just informs that meaning now. And it just, to me, it was like a reaffirmation that these decks are, speaking to those archetypes that tie us all together. And it's just a beautiful thing. I think that's the magic in it. So, and not to mention, I got to geek out on some geeky stuff. So, next up, I think we're going to geek out on the High Priestess card. And if we're sticking with, which I am, sticking with the Pamela Smith art being the foundation for the research, and then, we'll look at some of the other representations. Hers has a lot of pomegranates. So I think we're going to have some fun diving into some Greek and Roman mythology with that. So until next time, if you are a patron and you're seeing this early on Patreon, thank you so much. If you are watching this later, please consider becoming a patron. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe, like, that would be wonderful. And I'll see you next time.